Albert, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to have you on and share a little bit about your story that we've been able to talk about and some of the work you're doing. I think there are certain aspects of self sabotage that goes on, and it's something that we've covered on the podcast before. But then, how does it apply specifically to the male psyche? I think that's going to be really important to touch on in our conversation, including using our vulnerability more as a superpower, as you've shared before with me. So, before we get into any of that, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself and what's brought you here
Sure.
today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Albert Bramante. I have a doctorate in psychology, and right now my primary occupation is I work in New York City as a talent agent. So I represent actors for film, TV, theater, commercial, print, and voiceover, and that's what I do in my full time position. I've also taught psychology classes for the past 22 years. I teach classes in personality theory, social psychology, developmental psych, and intro to psychology. And I'm interested here to talk about the topics that you mentioned, especially when it comes to vulnerability, the state of, the male psyche, overcoming self doubt. And I had wrote a book last year, Rise Above the Script, which deals with self-sabotage and self-defeating behavior and just the concept of self-doubt in general. Even though the book is geared towards performing artists, I feel like there's enough information in there to apply to anybody, regardless of an actor. On some level, we're all performers. And we're all performing the role, if you think about it, throughout life.
Yeah, of course. And one of the things that I found interesting, and I had asked you when we chatted previously, was what allowed you to get into this space of working with actors, right, in the talent side of
Mhm.
things. And if you could share a little bit about what got you into that space as well.
Sure, that's great. So I started very much so in high school in drama club. I was also a psychology major during my undergrad, and I took some theater classes, electives, and I really enjoyed the process of just watching art being made, watching art being formed, and just even performing in general. Now, I tried my stint as an actor a little bit in New York City, but I found that I love working more with actors behind the scenes than I did in front of the camera. So for me, it was just the joy of being on set, not so much for the performing aspect, but just the environment, the people, the energy. And it was so uplifting for me that I wanted to continue this, but not necessarily be an actor. So I started to brainstorm, what can I do that I can kind of get the best of both worlds, not necessarily being an actor, but still being on set. So I started helping with like production assistant work, casting, background casting, principal casting. So I was on set a lot and I really enjoyed it. And then I realized I just love acting. So I then pivoted to kind of like mentoring, supporting, and then eventually, starting my own company representing actors. So that's sort of how that happened. That happened by accident. That was really never my long-term goal or plan, necessarily was to be an agent. So it wasn't until that experience, after grad school that I realized this is something I really love doing. I really love working with actors. And so that's
Yeah,
how
no,
it's set up.
that's
That's here I am today.
for sure. No, that's great. And one of the other things I am curious to understand from you, based on you've got over 20 years of experience, what are the common themes that you see continuously showing up with the people you work with, especially in this space, right? Because sometimes there's that misconception that, oh, these people are like invincible. Look at how great
Mhm.
they are on camera, but they're probably struggling more than the average person. And unfortunately, you don't truly appreciate it. Over the last few years, because of social media, a lot of the actors are now coming out and talking about their mental health, which is great. But before, I would say
Mhm.
I think that's more recent in the last 5 to 10 years. Before that, what were you observing and what are some of the common themes?
The major common thing is self-doubt, is because of the unpredictability of the industry. So a lot of times what people are looking at of having it all together, they're only seeing 2 or 3% of all the actors that are out there. Those are the ones that are really like mainstream A-list actors that are household names. There's hundreds of thousands of other actors that will never know their name. And sometimes they even not know their face because there's so much oversaturated market. And unlike other professions, show business is a gig economy, which means that it's gig to gig. It's not like a job where you're going to be having a long-term career, where you're going to be working in an office and then have a good, cushy retirement plan. There's instability there, which can be exciting and liberating for a lot of people because of that. There's no long-term commitment. You have to punch in or work from a Gretchen company. However, there's an instability there of when will you get your job? Will you get a job? And that sometimes can creep in after a while. And then you get your well-intentioned family and friends that are going to say, well, maybe it's time to get a real job, or maybe it's time to quit the acting thing. And, especially if you spend $80,000 to $100,000 on a degree. Let's say you went to a conservatory, to a university or college for acting. You spent 80 to 100 grand on your BFA. That's minimum. It could be even more than that. Now, where do you go? It's like, okay, now I have my degree. I'm ready to work. You may not find work for a while. Whereas in other professions, you get a degree, you get a pussy job, maybe after 4 or 6 months job hunting, and there you go. So that's, I think, the biggest misconception of it. And even when you land that big job, whether, let's say, you land a Broadway contract or a lead in a TV series or lead in a movie, once that movie is over, you're back to square one again. Or let's say you become lead in a TV series and you sign a multi-year deal. Great. Well, your job is dependent on the ratings. So if the TV show gets canceled, which happens more than it lasting, most TV shows don't last more than a 4 seasons unless it's a hit. Other than that, you could be out of a job in less than a year. And so there's that. And then, of course, you have to have health insurance. And the performance union, SAG-AFTRA and Actors Equity, they do offer insurance programs, but you have to make a threshold of a certain of income, which is around $26,000 a year, just in acting alone, which is very hard to do. So there's a lot of obstacles there too that come in, and not to add on top of any vulnerabilities or any type of trauma that comes up.
Yeah, so let's touch on those traumas and vulnerabilities. Like, what do you see? Because again, we tend to talk about trauma a lot nowadays, but one of the things you shared with me is that these people are also working through their own traumas, and perhaps they don't have the same amount of luxury because, again, because of their status or because of their schedule, do they have the time to even go work on some of the things that we need to work through when we're dealing with trauma? And then how does that lack of vulnerability show up and impact their capacity to go seek help?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of factors there that can impact their vulnerability, their childhood, their just like any other person. You come in through you suffered trauma maybe at an early age. It can be anything. So neglect, death at an early age, death of a family member at an early age in the first 7 years of life. So these can be significant traumas. Obviously, assault or abuse, anyway, can be a trauma. Neglect, even the thing about trauma, it doesn't have to necessarily be sensational trauma. It can be micro traumas, like day in the life type of traumas. Trying to fight, compete for your parents' affection, having a strict overbearing parent, being punished a lot. So or just the illusion you have to jump through hoops to get approval from mom or dad. That over time can start to add up. And then now, a lot of times with performers, just with actors, sometimes they get really so hard of a role or to a character, especially if it's drama, they have to feed into the drama, lead into it. And it's called method acting. Some schools will call it method acting, where you really have to dig deep to almost experience the same emotions that the character you're portraying is. If you're in a crying scene, sometimes in acting schools, they'll train you to go into a scene that made you cry. And while that's important for the role, and that often will give a great performance, but it's also what happens when the camera stops rolling, or what happens when the curtain closes when you're on stage. Now you're dealing with another set of trauma that it's like, oh, that's great. Okay, have a good night. And now you have someone who's really dealing with so much anger and underneath the pain. So there's that issue that often comes up, is unresolved trauma because of the role. And a lot of times actors will go through intense preparation. Some of your best method actors of our time. And one of the cases I bring up is Heath Ledger. If you remember the Heath Ledger, like The Dark Knight, that was his last movie. Yes. And some were saying that it was really that role that kind of pushed him over the edge. And unfortunately, now I definitely agree that it was that, but I also think there probably had to lead a lot of stuff that was winding up to that point that wasn't dealt with. And it was just kind of like that, The Dark Knight role kind of might have pushed him over the edge. Was like, okay, this was a tipping point. And so what I really feel, and I hope that we can develop some systems just in general about how do we change this? How do we set the stage for this to end? How can we get to the trauma and yet still get the same performance but not have the trauma? And that's an interesting paradox, because yes, we want the actor to feel that raw emotion, because then it'll transform the viewers. They'll feel that emotion too, because at this point, what's really happening, the secret is they're not acting, anymore as an actor. They're like being in the moment. They become that character, which again adds a great element to the performance, but at the same time, it really brings up some unseen issues. And this is why we see a lot of Hollywood in rehab. A lot of actors, singers, performers, musicians are in rehab all the time, or dealing with substance issues because they're trying to numb pain.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And it's finding that balance, right? Like as you're touching, you obviously want to heal that trauma and deal with it, because otherwise you're continuing to bring it up in unhealthy ways. But for actors who've done that, you still need to be able to tap into something to be able to deliver that emotional performance that's needed for a specific scene. Like when I was doing some theater work and acting, one of the things my teacher was teaching me was put yourself in the shoes of the character, and what does the character want? Really connect with that. And I think the good actors really embody that. And as you could see, even in the Joker movie series, or like The Dark Knight, like Heath Ledger or Joaquin Phoenix, they're embodying the character where it's hard to even tell, okay, is this real or not real? So there's that portion as well, right? Like, how do actors tap into that emotion? And obviously, as you're saying, it shouldn't be coming from a place of unresolved trauma. It should be coming from a place of where you've resolved it, but you can still connect with that emotion.
Or just be able to shut it off when the camera stops rolling. Okay. Or when the scene is over. Okay, now shut it off. To the point that you can go home and not let it affect you, or not be traumatized by it. There's an actor that I know, that working at method actor, who for protection to be anonymous, when he's preparing for a horror movie, and he had to be a serial killer, and he spent a month before the filming started, isolated himself in a hotel from his wife and family, and watched hours of serial killers documentaries. Had pictures of crime, scenes splattered across his room, and he would spend hours looking at the crime scene to kind of get the character. Now he did a great job in the movie, but afterwards he was having nightmares. Afterwards, he needed his own type of therapeutic that. And I'm like, okay, great, you gave that great performance, and that's wonderful as an actor. But how can you shave off the secondary aspect of it so you don't need therapy, so you're not having the nightmares? And that's something I don't quite have the answer for right at this time. Because as you said, there is that the other side of it. Yes, this is what really gives the actor the great performance. But this is also what will make them sometimes go off the deep end.
So how does vulnerability then come into play here? Let's talk about that, because that's something you believe is a superpower.
Yeah, I mean, especially, and I say this kind of for men, especially because males were socialized to be tough. We're socialized to have it together. I mean, we're seeing it maybe a little bit easier nowadays, but I grew up in the 80s. I'm a Gen X. So I, grew up in a time where boys don't cry. And be a man was like the mentality of take it like a man, be a man, and be tough. But at the same time, we've often saw a lot of men becoming alcoholic, a lot of men, going to violence or even drug use. And, and so when I talk about vulnerability, it's not about weakness. And a lot of people are like, well, if I'm vulnerable, I'm weak. Or especially now, I'm not going to talk about this. Don't affect me. And it does. Or like classic point is, one of my good friends was this was several years ago. She was on a date with her husband, who became a man who became her husband. And they were seeing a really sad movie. And he kept laughing at it. And at first he thought he was really insensitive. How could he be laughing at it? And I kind of said, I don't think that was insensitivity. We often laugh when we're uncomfortable. Or even when we're upset, we laugh or sad. So I think that his laughing could have been a way to cry. Because alternatively, right after he was having his laughing fit, he excused himself to go to the restroom. And I'm like, I kind of think I know what was happening in that stall. He let it out. Was getting to it. Because he didn't want to look weak. And I can understand that because we received so many messages. I mean, look at look at even advertisers to children, to boys, the toys that are often marketed to boys are like, these war things, Transformers, Joe men. Be tough. That's what the message you receive, not from our parents, but from society. And, we don't have time to admit our feelings and to have that. And it's challenging because, again, we're socialized to do that. And a lot of men get really uncomfortable when talking about feelings. We don't know how to. And unfortunately, we see this a lot in marriages because, then the wife will say, well, why doesn't he open up to me? He doesn't know how to. It's not that he doesn't care. He doesn't know how to open up. He was never given that blueprint because even mothers were tough on sons who would tough it out and, don't cry. And I think that one of the destructive messages we hear, especially boys, is, well, stop acting like a girl. And we take a step back and say, well, that's supposed to mean. And so we get these kind of contextual messages, about how it's supposed to be, whether we're to be a boy or a girl. And so that's where vulnerability comes in. And the only way you're going to get through a problem or really work through it is by dealing with it head on. Otherwise, again, we start to see these violence, aggression, loneliness. And that's why sometimes we'll hear stories of men snapping, or even there's a higher suicide rate amongst men versus females. Now, the statistic when it comes to suicide is that women are more likely to talk about it, but men are more likely to succeed when it comes to suicide because A, they choose more violent means, and B, they're silent about it. They won't really unless it's too late. And that's what we see a lot of these men snapping
Yeah,
because there's no
absolutely.
way, there's no outlet for them to talk about it. And the only way you're going to get through it is by actually talking through it and by facing it and confronting whatever the trauma or the pain, you have to confront it. And that's even with sobriety. Like I
Yeah,
was one of my former acting clients who actually left the business, went on after 10 years, he became sober. After 10 years of alcohol use, he became sober. What he said was it was the most hardest thing he had to do. And it wasn't so much the physical detox from alcohol. The hardest thing he had to do was the emotional side of things and actually have to face whatever the demons that he's really held behind. So I think that's where vulnerability is so important. So we don't have these cases like that where these men are snapping or that these actors are having such a hard time with sobriety.
yeah, yeah. You're touching on a couple of really crucial points, which I do want to emphasize again. One, like you said, the numbing or the acting out is to avoid those difficult feelings. I see this a lot. I talk about it a lot. And the other side, if the emotions aren't being dealt with, they come out in unhealthy ways. So I see this quite a bit in the therapy side of things where men are really struggling. A lot of the times when they're talking to me, one of the impressions I get, whether they're telling me directly or indirectly, is this is the first time they're actually opening up to someone and even speaking about things. So when you think about it from that lens, too, that they've spent their whole lives not feeling seen, heard, or understood, you can imagine the pressure that puts on an individual, and the stress just accumulates over time. And that's where you see a lot of that stress relief is unfortunately at times even leading to like death by suicide. And that's the sad part of it
Yeah.
all. Even though we're seeing some improvement, we're obviously having, like you and I are having this conversation, more and more people are having these conversations, but we still have a long way to go. And that's the reality. And then yeah. And then one of the other things you had also shared was because of this trauma or these feelings aren't being dealt with or talked about in real time, they're just being prolonged, that can lead to procrastination and self-sabotaging. And that's not necessarily just limited to actors. This
Yeah.
can be applied to anyone because you see that response to shame as
Mhm.
well. If I don't go out and put myself out there and risk failure, then I don't need to face that.
Yeah.
And then I can just, self sabotage or use self preservation as a way of protecting myself. So, how's that showing up in
Well,
different
you,
realms
you
from
mentioned a
your
good point.
perspective?
And I often say procrastination is really a response to trauma. And there's been a lot, you see, there's hundreds of books, hundreds of programs, and procrastination now. That's great. I think that's good. But it's only dealing with a band aid approach because why are we procrastinating? And it could be, like you said, self preservation. Again, the fear of putting myself out there because I could be re traumatized. And I mean, this is even subconscious. We don't even realize we're doing it. So this is why it's like you often will hear some people say, "Well, I work better under pressure," or "I work, I like to be under deadline." No, that's not necessarily true because no matter how hard you work, or how efficient you say you work, if you're stressed out because of the deadline, the efficiency of what it is you're setting out to do is not going to be ideal. And if we don't deal with that, what's the underlying cause of this self-preservation or procrastination? Or even just perfectionism. I feel like even perfectionism is a symptom of trauma.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that comes up a lot. And what I see is, again, it's just a form of protecting oneself. And then that's where people fall into that shame
Yeah,
spiral.
because then we see a message. Why did you wait for the last minute? Or you should have done this. Study harder the next time. And otherwise, if we don't deal with again the underlying cause, it's just we're gonna find ourselves like on a hamster wheel, just keep spinning, and not getting anything done. And it's like, why can't I do anything right? And then it adds even more shame now. And now you're just adding a deeper level of shame and spiraling downhill because you're not dealing with the actual, procrastination or the issue, which is trauma. And that it has to be dealt with. And this is again why coaches are more important, really important now, and even therapists are really needed because this has to be worked through. And the only way we're going to work through trauma is by actually confronting it. And one thing I will often say about with the actual work, it's not going to be glamorous often when you do this work in work time. It's going to not feel good, but you have to work through it. And I often use the metaphor of like going for surgery. You go for surgery to get, something that could be life threatening or something that could be really hurting you. But initially, the surgery may hurt you even more for the first month or so. The same thing sometimes going for therapy for trauma. It may hurt initially in the beginning, but the only way you're going to get through is you have to go through that to get to the on the other side, and that's healing.
Yep, I agree. You have to go through it to have that breakthrough. Absolutely. Now, the other thing you shared was you've come up with proven psychological strategies to help performers. And I think that's more of the practical stuff. And what I do want to share with the listeners is this could be applied in anyone's life. It doesn't necessarily have to be limited to performers because we all, like you said, are performing in one way or another in our daily
We sure
lives.
are.
So, what are some of these strategies that people can become familiar with?
Well, the one strategy is to watch the language that you use. So to yourself, not only to other people, to yourself. So what I would say is avoid like the term aspiring or struggling or starving or difficult or impossible or I can't. Simple things, even just as language is important. Now, what I often say about building another actionable strategy is if you really want to level up, is start hanging around and associating yourself with more successful people in your field. People that more so for artists, hang out with more successful artists because they will build you up. And one of the well-known books in our industry is Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, and he talks about a concept called masterminds. And I think this is one of the actual strategies to start overcoming self-doubt and is to start creating your own masterminds, either online or even virtual, of hanging around with experts and just being around those that are really successful in their field would start consuming their content and implementing their strategies. And also taking action is important. One of the things I often talk about is there's a difference between to-do lists and action items. So to-do lists are counterproductive, I feel. Like, I'm going to have this list of things I need to do. Well, that's great. Every day, if I don't take any action for it, the list is going to get longer and I'm going to get more and more shameful because these things have not been done. So start taking action, even small steps. And one of the good things about having a coach or having someone you can work with is the accountability. So one of the best ways to hold yourself accountable is put something on your calendar. Schedule something. One of my own coaches had used that in her methodology, which is putting on your calendar. When you put something on your calendar, you're making a commitment that it's real and it's going to happen. And when you're productive, it's hard to self-sabotage because things are being done.
Yeah, I think even with that, what I find is I agree with you. Putting it on a calendar or somewhere allows you to see it and it becomes a bit more real in the sense that you're working towards a commitment. But one of the things I feel often, again, going back to the self fulfilling prophecy kind of concept, they will set a very aggressive goal and then fall short. And then that will serve as evidence that, hey, I can't do this. So at least, while I agree with you, the accountability piece is important. But what I would like to emphasize is being realistic with yourself. That is the goal too aggressive. And sometimes starting small can lead to a lot of productivity in the future, right? We've all seen this. It's kind of like a meme now online where you see 1% every day is like exponentially greater in the long run over the course of a
Mhm.
year. So just thinking about that too is what is your 1% improvement?
Yeah, well,
So that's something I'd like to add to
then
that
that's
piece for
absolutely
sure.
correct. Is like the saying goes, the journey of 1,000 steps starts at step one. So taking a small action, and this is where a lot of people have these lofty goals. And I want to even touch on like the whole idea of New Year's resolutions, which I think are way overrated, and 90% of people who make New Year's resolutions never stick to them because they're very often very lofty and big. I'm going to work out heavily in the gym when you haven't been to the gym in years. So now all of a sudden you're going to go every day. No, it should be, and why do we have to wait for the new year? That's cliche. Start tomorrow
Yeah.
or start now,
Yeah.
and start small. If you haven't been exercising 7 days a week constantly, start with 1 or 2 days a week, start with 3 days a week and build it up there. And start small. But that, or even writing a book, well, you have start setting to do a couple of pages a day, small,
Yeah.
because then when you achieve it, it becomes, now this is more productive. And even if it is 1% better than you were yesterday,
Yeah.
eventually it's going to, 1% is going to add up to 100%.
Yeah, and unfortunately, people want a change overnight without putting in the consistency in the work. Going back to that gym exercise, I remember really every year, it's just the gyms are packed, right? And it would drive me nuts. And some of the regulars that I would know, we would be, as a joke, taking bets on when we would expect that rush to die down. And typically by mid-February, late February, you'd see it would be
Of
back to
course,
normal.
we're even sooner than that in some cases. And so that's definitely, because again, it's just that unrealistic expectation, and it's undoable too. And or a lot of people don't realize that there's going to be a little bit of attraction leading some pain and growth. Maybe they get sore or they get tired, and it's like, I'm not going to do this again. Not realizing that's a good thing. And that same thing even with psychological growth. It's like, look, there's going to be growing pains when it happens at times. But you're right. Especially with the internet and social media and all that, there's so many instant gratifications. It's like, okay, you can make $1 million in a day, or you see, earn 6 figures while you sleep. And all it is just, it's falling into that instant gratification. I want results now rather than I have to wait, because everything with the internet now is instant gratification. So one of the skills that's really important, and I feel for anybody to self-improve, is to be able to delay gratification, to delay the rewards. And I'll bring up one piece of research that was done in the 60s and 70s. It was a famous marshmallow test in psychology where
Yeah.
I'm sure you may have heard about this too. They give two kids in a room.
Yeah.
When I put a kid in a room, and I give them the marshmallow and tell him, or, if you wait 5 minutes or 10 minutes when I leave the room, and if you haven't eaten a marshmallow, I'll give you two. What they were doing when they would leave the room, they would secretly videotaping the kids and see how they were reacting. And they followed the kid. In the first round of these studies, they followed these kids all throughout their teenage and young adult lives. And the ones that were able to wait the 10 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes, were much more better adjusted, had better grades, had better outcomes than those who gave implementation right away. So there's a lot of clear evidence that if we delay gratification, we can be much more successful.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. Yeah, yeah, I'm familiar with this study. I think it was actually 15 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, the idea is, can you delay that gratification? And
Yeah.
yeah, to your point, it was a longitudinal study where they did follow these children around to see how they ended up faring in their adult lives. Now, coming back to something else you shared was the whole idea of language. I definitely understand why, but I do want to open it up a little bit more and go deeper into why, from your perspective, in terms of keeping like just being aware of the words you're using and how you're speaking can impact your future.
100%. Exactly. The words you say. And, even like adding simple tweaks, like saying yet is important. I haven't reached this level of success yet, rather than noting it as a letdown. Or as an actor, I haven't been on Broadway yet. Because when you add the word yet, this three-letter word can be very powerful. Because it doesn't mean what you're doing is when you say, well, I've done this, you're kind of putting yourself as a Swiss thing. But if you add the word yet, now it's possible. And also, and this kind of goes into like what I talked about earlier about not identifying yourself with a struggling artist, a starving artist, which is romanticized, especially in the artistic world. Well, I'm a starving artist. No, you're not. You're a fulfilled artist. You have everything you need. You're a working actor. You're a working artist, especially what they're training. And you want professional production. You're a working actor. And I think when you identify yourself like that as successful, and you already take on that identity, you'll be much more successful in a sense, because it's like you're taking that as acting as if it's already happening.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think words are powerful, and how you speak can demonstrate what you believe about yourself as well. And that's where you tend to act and behave based on what you're saying.
Well, yeah.
And that's the idea here.
And it's forming your identity too, because how do you identify yourself is extremely important. What's your identity? And who are you? And I'm a working actor. I'm going to work a lot harder versus if I identify myself as a starving or struggling actor. Well, then my subconscious mind is saying, okay, well, we'll make it so. You're going to struggle. You're going to starve.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. Well, no, Albert, this has been great. I really appreciate everything you've shared and some of the practical strategies that people can be aware of and also implement in their lives. I think that can be really helpful. And like we've both concluded, that performance is something we're doing every day. So how can we learn about these things and be aware of how we're showing up? Oh, sorry, you're just on mute.
Sorry about that. I think just taking small steps of achievement in a sense is important. On celebrating the tiny wins in a sense, that's important. Whatever you did in one day is important. Pick one day at a time. And that's the one thing too, is just to measure your successes, and even if for micro success, you have success.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, this is great. Now, for listeners that want to learn more about you and your work, what are some ways they can
Well,
do
you could
that
go
and
to my
find you
website,
online?
albertbramante.com, which is currently under construction, but it will be revised in the next few weeks. You could also find me on LinkedIn. I put a lot of content out there. Also on Instagram and Facebook, I put a lot of content out on there. And I love having conversations.
For sure. No, we'll definitely put all of that in the show notes. But thank you again, Albert. I appreciate your time today, and thank you for sharing your insights with the listeners.
And I appreciate
today.
the invite and appreciate being here.